Okay, welcome. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, bonjour, talofa, kia ora, good day, and welcome to this afternoon session, Assessing and Mitigating Threats and Pressures on Inland and Coastal Water Quality in the Pacific. In this session, we have 4 very exciting speakers. The session is focused on water quality, where we will explore 2 examples of work in both Fiji and New Caledonia, outlining the difficulties, the successes, but also its practical application to other places, to other Pacific islands. We will also explore widely how and what a freshwater health index is and how it can be applied to Pacific islands in terms of its suitability as well as its sustainability. We'll also look at inland and coastal water quality data in terms of its conservation status and learning from traditional knowledge and the use of new approaches and technologies to respond to these emerging threats, such as climate and the pandemics. Participants, my name is Anthony Taloli. You can call me Tony, and I will be your moderator and host this afternoon. If you could please put your questions to the Q&A chat, we will be happy to answer them. And I'd like to note that I will remind you throughout the session that if we don't get to your questions, we don't get to answer your questions during the Q&A session, that we invite you to join the lounge, where you will get to meet the speakers, other speakers, as well as other participants. So let's go. And let me briefly mention the speakers. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers and presenters. We've got Ms. Pearl Winchester, Dr. Nick Sota, Dr. Philip Jabu, Mr. Patrick J. Walsh. So let's begin our session. Let's begin our program. And I will introduce to you our opening session speaker. So Ms. Pearl Winchester is the Water Policy and Water Department's Interconnection Officer, facilitator for the Protege Water Thematic New Caledonia EDF 11 project from the government of New Caledonia. Her role leads her to coordinate the mission Inter-Services di Lufu, which is a network made up of agencies from the water service of the different institutions in New Caledonia. She thus coordinates multiple thematic working groups, so many, up to 10 thematic working groups, and follows the good progress of water actions carried out under the Protege program. In her free time, she is involved in volunteering. She has a passion for mountain biking, and she has been part of the group that's been organizing the Megarando, which is the biggest sporting event in New Caledonia for several years. She's also a scout leader with the Scouts du Mont d'Or. So she was born in New Caledonia, so she's from the Pacific. She is an engineer, and she is a good advocate for the conservation in the Pacific. Pearl, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Merci beaucoup, Anthony. Bonjour à tous. Et je vais démarrer ma présentation. Je vais partager mon écran. Donc, je vais vous parler aujourd'hui de la protection et du suivi de la ressource en eau en Nouvelle-Calédonie et des missions notamment du service de l'eau de la DAVAR. Donc, c'est un des services du gouvernement de la Nouvelle-Calédonie pour pérenniser la ressource en eau. Donc, je vais vous présenter ça selon 5 grands points. Donc, déjà, des éléments de contexte avec la Nouvelle-Calédonie dans le Pacifique. Ensuite, la présentation des périmètres de protection des eaux que nous mettons en place, notre réseau de suivi physico-chimique, notre réseau de suivi hydro-pluviométrique et enfin, un petit mot sur l'Explocarto, la partie géomaticienne de nos données. Donc, la Nouvelle-Calédonie. La Nouvelle-Calédonie est située, comme vous le voyez sur la carte, pas loin de l'Australie et de la Nouvelle-Zélande. Elle est composée d'une grande terre qui fait environ 450 mètres de long et 50 km, pardon, 450 km de long et 50 km de large, ainsi que les îles Loyauté. Nous avons une forte disparité en termes de précipitations entre la côte est et la côte ouest. Il y a un facteur de pluviométrie qui va entre 2 et 5 entre la côte est et la côte ouest. Il pleut beaucoup plus sur la côte est et il y a beaucoup plus de périodes de sécheresse sur la côte ouest. Pour ce qui est des captages pour l'alimentation en eau potable, en Nouvelle-Calédonie, nous utilisons principalement des captages superficiels pour 64% d'entre eux. Et 49%, donc quasiment la moitié de nos captages, sont situés sur terre coutumière. Pour protéger notre eau, l'eau de consommation, l'eau potable, donc les captages, nous instaurons des périmètres de protection des eaux. Donc, les périmètres de protection des eaux sont une protection administrative des captages destinés à l'alimentation en eau potable. Ces périmètres sont composés de 3 sous-périmètres. Un périmètre de protection immédiate qui est situé de façon très proche du captage en question, des périmètres de protection rapprochés et un périmètre de protection éloigné. Vous voyez sur les images qui sont à droite et à gauche un petit peu à quoi cela ressemble sur la carte. Donc, l'instauration d'un périmètre de protection des eaux est une procédure administrative qui est coordonnée par la DAVAR, mais qui doit être faite en relation avec beaucoup d'institutions différentes. Et la durée de la procédure prend au mieux 1 an et demi, sinon plusieurs années. Aujourd'hui, les périmètres de protection des eaux, nous avons 59% de nos captages qui sont protégés, comme vous le voyez sur la carte, dont des vieux arrêtés de l'État et des nouveaux arrêtés qui ont été établis par le gouvernement. Néanmoins, nous rencontrons des problèmes dans ces périmètres de protection des eaux. Donc, nous rencontrons des problèmes de feu, des problèmes d'espèces envahissantes, notamment les cerfs et les cochons. Nous rencontrons des problèmes d'exploitation minière et d'autres activités anthropiques comme le tourisme ou les loisirs. Quels sont les impacts du coup de ces causes? C'est d'abord l'érosion qui crée de la turbidité et des eaux rouges, qui engrave aussi les cours d'eau et les captages superficiels, qui influent sur les rejets et qui à terme impactent le lagon. Nos problématiques que nous rencontrons administrativement sont que les textes réglementaires sont obsolètes, que les arrêtés administratifs de périmètre de protection sont parfois non respectés, qu'il n'y a pas de protection physique de nos captages et que, par des recours au tribunal, les arrêtés de protection des périmètres de protection sont annulés. Nous avons quelques agents qui font la police de l'eau, mais avec beaucoup de difficultés. Pour le suivi, pour les périmètres de protection, il y a aussi un diagnostic qui a été réalisé par le VVF en 2018. Donc, on n'a que 50 périmètres de protection des eaux sur 244 qui sont aujourd'hui physiquement protégés, afin que les gens ne viennent pas directement se baigner dans le captage ou que les cerfs et les cochons ne viennent pas directement s'abreuver dans les captages. Donc, ça représente peu de captages concernés encore à ce jour. Et selon une étude VVF réalisée en Nouvelle-Calédonie en 2018, 90% des bassins versants des périmètres de protection sont dans un état dégradé. 220 périmètres de protection sur 244. Donc, c'est à cause des feux, à cause des érosions, une perte de couverture forestière, etc. Comme vous le voyez sur la photo à gauche, sur les photos à gauche qui viennent du VVF, le feu est vraiment impactant, même autour des captages qui sont censés être des captages AEP. Pour ce qui est de la pollution plastique, on a de la chance en Nouvelle-Calédonie, c'est que nous avons une loi anti-plastique qui a été votée en décembre 2018 pour les sacs plastiques à usage unique. Donc, on n'en voit pas encore les effets aujourd'hui, mais en tous les cas, les comportements commencent à changer. Par contre, cette loi anti-plastique n'inclut pas les bouteilles en plastique. Du coup, pour suivre la qualité de nos eaux, la DAVAR, le service de l'eau, a mis en place un réseau de suivi de qualité physico-chimique. Donc, nous avons 64 points de suivi et nous essayons de réaliser 3 à 4 mesures par an sur l'ensemble de la Grande Terre. Donc, il s'agit d'un suivi physico-chimique et d'un suivi bactériologique des eaux brutes, avant qu'elles rentrent dans le tuyau. Nous avons du coup, en Nouvelle-Calédonie, réussi à créer 3 indices de suivi biologique. Donc, en 1999, l'indice biotique de l'ANC, en 2007, l'indice biosédimentaire et en 2018, l'indice diatomique NC. L'ensemble de ces indices ont été créés en concertation avec de nombreux acteurs de la Nouvelle-Calédonie et vous pouvez trouver plus d'informations sur notre site internet. Nous avons aussi, pour le suivi de la quantité, en Nouvelle-Calédonie, nous avons mis en place un réseau de suivi hydro-pluviométrique avec des pluviomètres. Nous en avons 79 au service de l'eau qui sont installés sur l'ensemble de la Grande Terre. Ce réseau de pluviomètres est complémentaire de celui de Météo France, qui dispose aussi de 75 pluviomètres. Donc, nous travaillons en concertation avec Météo France sur ce sujet, afin d'avoir un meilleur suivi des précipitations et donc de l'eau tombée qui tombera dans nos rivières par la suite. Nous avons du coup aussi un réseau hydropluviométrique qui permet de suivre les quantités d'eau dans les rivières, qui est composé de 45 limimètres. Le plus vieux de nos limimètres est actif depuis 1955, donc il a 65 ans, 65 ans de données. Et nous réalisons aussi, grâce à 4 agents de terrain, des jaugeages, donc des mesures ponctuelles de débit, environ 760 par an. Nous réalisons aussi un suivi de nos nappes phréatiques et souterraines, avec environ 120 points de suivi ponctuels qui sont relevés environ 2 fois par an depuis 2008. L'information la plus importante pour ces réseaux-là, c'est d'essayer de collecter de la donnée le plus tôt possible, parce que c'est comme ça qu'on se rend compte des évolutions et des impacts qu'il y a entre justement les menaces et la réalité de la ressource en eau. Du coup, l'ensemble de ces données, nous essayons de les concentrer sur l'Explo-Carto, qui est un outil grand public mis sur Internet. Et du coup, nous réalisons nos mesures avec le GPS afin de pouvoir les mettre sur les systèmes d'information géographique. Cet outil permet de centraliser les données et de les diffuser auprès des acteurs qui sont intéressés. Et c'est possible car en Nouvelle-Calédonie, nous avons une forte communauté de géomaticiens. Voilà, c'était ce que nous faisions à la DAVAR au gouvernement pour le suivi de la ressource en eau. Merci beaucoup. Hop. Anthony, je te rends la parole.
Isabella, thank you very much for that. And we look forward to the questions that will be coming to you. I think it's a good example of how important it is to collect data, but also to be able to collect early information. So thank you very much for that. We go on to our second speaker, which is Dr. Nick Sota. So Nick is an ecologist with over 25 years of experience. He has a wide range of interests in conservation and natural resources and natural resource management, including environmental water management, freshwater ecology, endangered species conservation, environmental monitoring and decision-making, climate change and capacity building. Nick has experience in a range of environments from Cambodia, from Cambodian rainforest to the deserts of Central Australia. He has worked in private consulting, government agencies, universities, and international conservation NGOs implementing and managing a range of complex research, education, and infrastructure projects and programs. Nick is currently Conservation International's freshwater manager for the Greater Mekong. Nick will be speaking on the potential for applying the Freshwater Health Index in the Pacific. Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tony. Share my screen. And I shall get started. So today I will give a brief overview of a tool CI and Partners has developed, the Freshwater Health Index, and see how it could potentially be used in the Pacific as a way of aggregating a lot of data about water catchments and aiding management and decision making. So the Freshwater Health Index, we measure catchment health by making clear connections between the ecosystem and the benefits that it provides to people. So not only are we looking at the biophysical system, but we focus also on then how that interacts with people, both the benefits that they receive and also how that system is actually governed and managed. We have a basic conceptual model which shows our 3 pillars for the Freshwater Health Index. We look at first ecosystem vitality, which is essentially the old metrics of how healthy the ecosystem is. This then flows through to the ecosystem services, so benefits that people receive from the ecosystem. And then this is all moderated, so that flows to stakeholders who then act on the ecosystem. And it's moderated through a lens of governance. So we examine each of these 3 components in the FHI. So the idea is that it turns data into knowledge. We've come up with a scoring system for each of these pillars, and then the indicators within them of a score between 0 and 100. 100 is good generally, and 0 is bad. One of the features we've tried to come up with the FHI is to be very flexible in how the indicators are calculated. So whilst we set the pillars for the FHI and what we think needs to be assessed, we're very, it's open to the user as to how they calculate them, although you do need to come up with a score between 0 and 100. We can use a variety of data sources as well. I'll say more on this tomorrow. This is an old slide, but also consultation's integral to the approach. So in our indicators, ecosystem vitality, water quantity, and so from the information that Pearl provided, there's data in New Caledonia. We can look at change in flow and change in groundwater. Water quality, which is very important for our focus of our talk. And again, Pearl presented some data that we could use for that. Bank condition, I'll give a few brief examples of bank modification and land cover naturalness at the end. Biodiversity, which Philippe will touch on. So the basic underpinning of the ecosystem. And then the services that are provided. So provisioning water supply, is the supply reliable? Biomass for consumption, so are people taking fish out of the system? Regulation and support, is there too much or too little sediment, which is an erosion problem? Water quality, flood regulation, are there too many floods, disease? And then we have a cultural indicator, which again, I think will be touched on later. We also look at how well the system is managed and what say people have in managing the system with our governance and stakeholders. And this is largely a survey instrument that we undertake. So looking at where we've done this, so my main area of focus has been here in the Tonle Sap and the Sekong and Shui Pok basins. Also looked at the Dongjiang and the Lanciang in China. We're now working in Okavango and South Africa, and we've done 3 basins in South America. The numbers at the bottom are the numbers of people living in the basin. So you'll note that they're rather larger than potential ones that would happen in the Pacific. For example, the Dongjiang of 53 million people is probably, it's in one of the most urbanized areas of the world. So the results, we try to present them fairly easily, both colour-coded and with numbers, with these colour wheels, and this is from the 3S. So for here, we would say our ecosystem vitality, a score of 64. It's a bit stressed, and mostly species of concern, so there's lots of endangered species. At the moment, for ecosystem services, it's providing a score of 80. So it's providing the services that are needed, although there's problems with sediment regulation and disease potentially. But the governance system is actually quite weak. So limited capacity to respond to rapid change. We've also developed a toolbox. So it's a standalone desktop application. And so it's becoming easier to calculate this. You can use the toolbox, calculate your metrics, it aggregates up the numbers. We're also developing R code for more options and also considering using Google Earth Engine for a lot of the sort of more complex analyses. So we'll look at relevance and challenges for the Pacific. It's fairly unique and poorly understood challenges in managing freshwater ecosystems. So many areas of the Pacific, from what I understand, freshwater resources haven't received a lot of attention. Although the monitoring that Pearl presented is encouraging because a lot of that data could be put into the FHI framework. Climate change is an increasing problem everywhere, not only just the Pacific, but particularly in the Pacific. And we can look at scenarios with the FHI looking at climate change. Increased demand for water resource development. So in a lot of areas, there's a lot more dams going in for hydropower and also extracting water. I think one of the challenges is multiple small catchments in many of the islands of the Pacific. So we work at a catchment scale, but whilst looking at that map of New Caledonia, there are data points everywhere. Many of them are probably only one per catchment, so it will be difficult to characterise a catchment, and many catchments probably don't have data. So that's an interesting challenge. And lack of data, many areas there isn't data. In our previous assessments, we've relied heavily on pre-existing data sources. So just one challenge that sort of brought to my attention for New Caledonia and other areas, and Pearl mentioned this as well. So forest degradation by invasive species, so deer and pigs, is having a big impact on land cover naturalness, which you can see in this picture here. So very degraded land, which has also led to modifications to the bank of the stream. So there's a lot of erosion happening here. Wildfire can also cause these problems, perhaps not to the same extent, roads and mining. So to come up with an indicator between 0 and 100 for these would be quite difficult, because I doubt you'll pick this up with satellite imagery because it's the understory that's a problem, and the same with the bank erosion as well. So it would be a sort of time-consuming and costly exercise to be measuring this, but it's pretty important information for managing the water resources. But collecting the data will be difficult, but I think managing it will perhaps be an even harder problem. So with that, I'll say thank you, and thank you for your time, and look forward to any questions later on.
Thank you for the great presentation and for the information and the application of some of the uses of it to Pacific Islands. I'm sure there'll be many questions on how it can be applied to the Pacific Islands. So let me go to our third speaker, So our third speaker is Dr. Philippe Jabot. Philippe has over 30 years of experience working in the field of wetland and freshwater conservation in New Zealand and in Oceania. He has authored many books, chapters, and international peer-reviewed articles related to freshwater conservation in Oceania. He was the Oceania Ramsar Convention's Scientific and Technical Review Panel representative between 2005 and 2011. And as the Chief Technical Advisor for the IUCN Regional Office for Oceania in 2006-2009, he authored the first IUCN program for Oceania and helped secure funding to support its implementation. Philippe visits regularly the Pacific Islands to survey the freshwater fauna of streams and rivers in collaboration with the French National History Museum. Philippe will be speaking on managing freshwater ecosystems and habitats in the Pacific region. Philippe, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you, Tony. I'll start sharing. Here you go. So as Tony said, this is what I'm going to talk about. And as he also said, I've done a lot of the work with the French Natural History Museum, which I want to acknowledge, and also all the many people from the Pacific Islands we have worked with in the field. I want to read out this little text from our Maori friends who live north from here along the Kaikoura coast on the South Island of New Zealand. Waterways have a special place in our heart. They are not just collections of gravel and water and fish. They feed the people, but they also connect the mountains to the sea, which Māori call ki uta ki tai. And they are the lifebloods of Papatuanuku, have mana and a large presence of their own. Our belief is that the rivers should be treated with total respect and their health given the utmost priority. Māori people see water as two types of systems, the one that distribute the water, the rivers, and the ones that store the water, the wetlands. And you recognize, of course, that this is how most Pacific people look at the waterscapes. They don't call this ki uta ki tai, but they call it reach to reef. In New Zealand, there is more and more recognition of Mātauranga Māori, the Māori system knowledge. Its application, to me, centers around the concept of whenua, a concept very similar to that of Vanua in Fiji, for instance, with 3 dimensions of spirits, places, and people. Here you have an example of how the core Māori values associated with site works, how goals are written using the Māori language, like restoring the Māori, and also making reference to customs. Let me examine closer as an example one of those values. I want to talk here about manaakitanga, which is a process of showing respect, generosity, and care for others. It's my page now. It is. How do those values and concepts may apply, for instance, to the Western framework of ecosystem services? Nature contributes to the well-being of local communities, and when people are feeling well, they are more likely to care for nature. A balance is created between people, the spiritual values of those people and their beliefs, and the environment. This is captured in a proverb in Māori, toi tu te maraea te ngā mauta, toi tu te maraea tangaroa, toi tu te tangata. And of course, this is people caring for the land and the land caring for people. Looking again at the ecosystem framework, what I want to focus on, and Nick has already alluded at that, I want to focus on the two key things that matter to Māori: the provisioning services as well as the cultural services, which Nick has briefly touched on, but he did say we will talk about it as well. Key services that Waterscapes Plain Oceania gravitate mostly around provisioning services, and you've got them listed. And now let's talk about the cultural services. And lots of tools now in New Zealand have been developed to actually assess the cultural values of freshwater. And here's an example. This is a recent review which has been published just at the end of last year. I don't have time to take you through each of them. I've tried to summarize what is best to share with you. In a summary, there are 5 key areas that people talk about in those tools: monitoring the metaphysical aspects of the environment, the cultural and social aspects, but species matters as well. And of course, as I said before, food and what Māori people call mahinga kai. And Nick and Pearl have talked a lot about ecology, water quality and habitats, because you cannot do without this. Let's have a look quickly at the status of freshwater habitats and species in Oceania. You heard Stuart yesterday deliver his summary for the whole region for all ecosystems. What we do know is that between 2012 and 2020, the assessment hasn't changed. However, what we do need to notice is that everybody believes that this is currently in decline. He also mentioned that there were few documents to refer to make an assessment, so the confidence is not that high to assess those wetland ecosystems. I've put a few here that you may want to look at if you don't have knowledge of them. When you focus on biodiversity and species, you need to do a review like we did in 2012 under the auspices of IUCN in Suva. We had a red listing workshop for fish species. And this is what we obtained. So several things here we need to notice is that a lot of the people couldn't be assessed simply because we don't have any information. Of all the species assessed, we had a half roughly that were or did look fine, but we've got another half where things start to appear. And if you focus on figure 2, you see that the endemic species in particular is where the trouble might start. And we need therefore to do to bear this in mind. The savior perhaps for those species is their ability to migrate between the sea and the rivers. What we also need to understand for freshwater fauna is that they migrate not only between the sea and the rivers, but they also migrate along the rivers. And we do know there is a strong zonation in place for the habitats in which those species live, from the estuarine zone to reaches above 100 meters. This pattern is reproduced for the fish. I will show you briefly later another diagram like this. This is for crustaceans. It's all the species that we encounter in rivers in Pacific Islands. So of course, migrating species mean that not only the freshwater is important, but also the coastal zone and potentially the marine environment, such as coral reefs. The pressures have been mentioned both by Pearl and Nick, I think. What I want to put my touch on is the alteration of flows is really important in the Pacific Islands because more and more rivers are dammed to provide water to the resorts. And that will be interesting to see with the impact of COVID, how this is going to evolve. By building those dams, but also by building roads and all sorts of structures, we provoke the creation of barriers. Those fish and those species are migratory species. They need free passage to move up and down the rivers and from the coast to inland, and therefore this is an important issue. Habitat degradation has been largely mentioned by Pearl and Nick. I won't expand on this. I want to talk briefly about possible over-harvesting. You know that many countries in the Pacific have a goby fry fishery, And this hasn't been studied at all. And I'm glad to actually let you know that we are going to start a project in Tahiti to study that fishery. And we will look both at the freshwater and the marine phase of those species. So if you are interested by this, please do get in touch with me, because I'd like to create a network of people working on that topic of goby fry fishery. Introduced species, I'm sure other people during the conference will talk about this, but the two key gulty culprits are tilapia and the mosquito fish, of course. And climate change has been mentioned as well. So to wrap up, I guess some management considerations. Monitoring and has been covered by Pearl and Nick. Patrick, after me, will talk about actually establishing a locally managed freshwater areas similar to the LMMAs. So I'm looking forward to your presentation, Patrick, on this. I don't have time to expand on each of these points, but the first point is that we do need to be able to identify the different species. And this is why we published that book that you see on the top right on the diversity of those fish. And I do acknowledge also all the local people who have worked with us again. And there's several books for each country that have been produced, or not each country, but several. One is being developed currently for the Solomon Islands, and I acknowledge the work of David Pozzetto helping us doing that. The one thing I want to say, those fish are migrating, and these are the key species that can provide an indication of water quality, like for the crustaceans. But fish barrier, I mentioned that as well, is very important. And there are tools now that people can use. In New Zealand, we developed recently a New Zealand fish passage guideline document in 2018. I do encourage you to look it up on the internet and look at what you can do to solve and help resolve those barriers. What we know is that we need to share with local communities and then collaborate to better understand traditional knowledge. And we do have a framework that is now becoming very clear, which is that we need to collaborate and establish a dialogue with local indigenous people so we can start understanding their own knowledge that I briefly touched on at the beginning. So this framework is like a double-held waka in a way. You've got the Mataonga Māori here in New Zealand, the science Western knowledge. What we need to do is to build a bridge between the two in the middle so that the waka can cross the oceans. I thank you for your attention.
Hi, Philip. Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. And I like the final analogy between the waka and the ocean. So I thought that was very nice. So thank you for that. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions coming for all you three presentations. For the first three presenters. Our fourth and last speaker is Patrick J. Walsh. So Patrick is a senior economist with significant experience in environmental policy and conservation. His research focuses on benefit cost analysis, water quality, flooding, invasive species, and species conservation. Patrick has recently led 2 National Science Challenge programs in New Zealand on flood impacts and policy, and has done fieldwork in the Pacific on water quality management. Before coming to New Zealand, he worked at the US EPA, US Environmental Protection Agency. He currently leads a team of environmental and cultural and agricultural economists at manaakitanga. Patrick will be talking to us this afternoon on freshwater protected areas in action, the Tambus in Fiji. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen really quick. So today I'm going to be talking about a project that was done in coordination with Rescue and the University of the South Pacific. With Susie Greenhalgh, Pamela Booth, Izoa and Lakima Copeland. And freshwater pollution and destructive fishing are a problem in Fiji and several other Pacific islands. Although marine protected areas are now widely implemented and studied, freshwater protected areas receive much less attention. So this presentation summarizes some work done by us in the areas of Ra province, which is pictured here in the map in gray. And we held several workshops to discuss the local costs and benefits of protected areas, as well as several related ecosystem service provision. So there are several threats to freshwater resources in Fiji. Destructive fishing practices include overharvesting, illegal nets with damaging bycatch, and the use of bleach and duva, which is a toxin that is used to kill fish and can have significant downstream impacts. So it can increase the fish catch locally, but then when it washes downstream, there are significant ecosystem impacts. Freshwater protected areas can be difficult to implement as they can involve significant local costs. And this map, for instance, shows a tabu, which is another word for freshwater protected areas, in purple, which is instituted on the river right in front of the Nouvelle-Calédonie village, which is the red dot on the right. This forces people to travel farther for fishing activities. And although there are local benefits, there are also many benefits that accrue downstream to people outside of the village. So in these areas, there are many characteristics of a traditional public goods problem, as well as externality problems that are typically studied in environmental protection. Now, on the other hand, marine protected areas are fairly widely used, especially in the Pacific. There is a rich history for their use as a tool for conservation. And it's been estimated recently that approximately 1.2% of ocean water is covered by protected areas. And this map, for instance, shows an estimate of where protected areas are in marine spaces around Fiji. On the other hand, the inland nature of rivers, which can cross boundaries, land uses, and groups of people, are much harder to plan, implement, and enforce. And so, in our research in particular, we were really interested in looking at some of these localized issues. And so there is some existing literature on freshwater protected area applications, and evidence of their benefits is somewhat mixed, especially in some Asian and Australian case studies. And while smaller disjointed areas may provide significantly less benefit than watershed level planning, that was a common issue that was encountered. These freshwater protected areas can require significant coordination, and enforcement can also be a serious problem, as local and regional coordination is required to both implement and enforce a protected area. On the other hand, freshwater protected areas in the literature were cited as typically being implemented with other information sessions, for instance, on destructive fishing practices and other ecosystem service provision issues, which can help villages. Now, in Fiji in particular, freshwater protected areas are seeing increasing usage, particularly in the Ra province that we visited. Tabus have a long history in Fiji in both freshwater and marine settings, and they've traditionally been deployed to memorialize a village chief's death. In these cases, a 100-day fishing ban, referred to as a bogey drow, was instituted so that the resulting larger catch at the end could be used in a commemorative feast. And so this makes it so that the local area was more familiar with this type of protected area and instituting these. And starting in 2016 to 2017, the Fiji Rescue Program in the University of South Pacific started assisting villages with the implementation of more permanent taboos. These included education about destructive fishing, riparian protection, and other village and downstream impacts. And so these were also paired with other programs like riparian planting, mangrove restoration, and other related issues. So in 2018, 6 villages were visited for workshops on both freshwater protected areas and other ecosystem service issues. And the goal was to ask people about the local benefits and costs of the freshwater protected areas. And while these villages' experiences with taboos was likely at the early stages, since it was only about 1 to 3 years since they were implemented, we wanted to see what the early results were, and how people were feeling about them early on. And so it will naturally be important to follow up later on the longer term issues of these. In the workshops themselves, we used spatial maps and representations to help leverage local knowledge and guide discussion of impacts, to make sure that people were aware of where the taboos were and where some of the local restoration efforts were happening. We had them help draw maps of kind of the village location where water bodies were and where the taboos were. And most of the time found that people were acutely aware of where these things were happening, as well as the effects. So we had several surveys designed to try to solicit information alongside the maps, and guided discussion on these issues. And across a variety of these different groups, we found that the main benefits that people discussed included larger downstream fish catch, larger fish, species diversity, and then several villages focused on more diverse diets. So by restricting the amount of fish that people could catch in front of the village, it forced people to, look for other sources of protein and get much more diverse diets. One of the village nurses also noted improvements in health issues related to diets, although that was certainly a preliminary discussion. Other benefits that people discussed included better conditions for swimming, bathing, and washing, a healthier ecosystem. And then one group we talked to, the totem of the local village was a prawn, and they noticed that the prawns were having a rebound. And so there were significant cultural benefits for improving that population. On the other hand, when it came to costs, there were a number of localized costs that people mentioned, including having to go much further to catch fish. People were purchasing more fish to supplement their diets. Some villages were even spending money to stock fish. And overall, there was an increased budget on protein. But it was notable, however, that many participants acknowledged that these water bodies were headed this way already due to degradation. So many of these water bodies were already quite stressed. The ecosystems were already fairly degraded. And so, there's a general trajectory to have to do these things to begin with. And so the freshwater protected areas in many cases just, sped that up a little bit. Some other costs that people mentioned, including new skills and training needed. There were several fishermen that had to diversify into other areas. And also one of the main costs associated with these protected areas is the implementation costs in terms of time and workshop. So, there would have to be an initial information session, several programs where the village would gather and the elders would talk about, what the protected area would need. And then one of the main things mentioned was monitoring enforcement. Village leaders were tasked with enforcement, and so this took a variety of different forms, but required constant monitoring. Some used public shaming, for instance, at village meetings where violators were mentioned at public meetings. And so, overall, across these different workshops, we were fairly surprised to note that people were discussing these ecosystem benefits after only 1 to 3 years. Given this slightly small lag between implementation and the workshops, we were surprised to hear about larger fish. However, there were also these notable costs that came earlier, such as forced diversification of diets and the need to diversify skills and trades to supplement fishing. But there were also a number of reports of more people gardening on their plots and bringing in additional fruits and vegetables. And so, more research is certainly needed in this area since several of these places already had fairly degraded water bodies. So the reduction in fishing pressure and destructive fishing practices had fairly rapid effects as these areas rebounded. So there's certainly concerns about using a watershed approach and implementing these in less degraded areas. So in places with fairly good fishing, there might be a lot more resistance on the ground. And so, overall, this unique history of previous taboos may have made implementation easier in this area. And so, we're asserting that further study is definitely needed to assess the characteristics in other places that may not be as open to these. So, overall, we find a very positive outlook on freshwater protected areas in Ra Province. People were certainly wary of the costs, but recognize the potential benefits, and we're still quite open to their implementation. We can already see some ecosystem benefits in the area, and it is important, however, to note these early impacts of costs, particularly complaints about enforcement. And so there are potential programs that might be combined with freshwater protected areas. So in the social science and behavioral sciences, there may be ways to align incentives to make the enforcement less burdensome on local public officials. But overall, thank you very much for your time.
So Patrick, thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for sharing your experience and the Tabu work that was done in Fiji. So it's now time for questions, questions for the speakers. Just give me a sec. I'm just going to have a look and see whether we have any questions. But while we're doing that, I've got a couple of questions for. Maybe we'll begin with Pearl. So Pearl, you mentioned about the data that you were collecting, and that it's very important to have early information to react. Could you share with us some of maybe just one example of where that was a success, that you were able to get the data and then use that to react, please? Thank you.
Well, yes, sure. For the limnimeters, it's important to have a lot of data when we use it to calculate the floodplains after, because with the big range, you have more information on how many floods you had in the past, and see what is the maximum flow you can expect, or you could expect in your basin. So that's for safety, people safety. That's where we use it for the long range.
Okay, then thank you very much, Pearl. Thank you. And I've got a question for Nick. So Nick, the question is, you got a freshwater health index where there's and we recognize that there may be a need to collect more data for the use of it in the islands. The question that comes immediately to my mind is, what about saltwater health index, a coastal water health index? Because some of the smaller islands and many of the low-lying islands may not have the freshwater rivers as New Zealand or Australia or some of the Melanesian islands do. Can this system be used for coastal and marine?
So CI has actually developed an ocean health index. So we do have ocean health, but I believe that is, well, it's ocean. So it's going to be much broader, I think, in its scope than would be applicable to a small island. But there's not actually any reason why you can't use the three main pillars of ecosystem vitality, the services, and then the governance, and apply that to a coastal marine system as well. So the ecosystem needs to be healthy. It provides people with the services. Biomass for consumption would probably be the main one in terms of the fin fish and non-fish fishery, and then how well it's managed as well. So the indicators would be different, but there would also be some similarities, and obviously how they're calculated would be different as well. So I think it could be successfully adapted.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. So I've got a question for Patrick, and then the question is, what are the plans for long-term monitoring the sustainability of the FPA's outcomes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We had hoped to certainly follow up with that within the next year or two, but the recent travel bubble that everyone's experiencing is really throwing some kinks in the plans. So yeah, we hope to propose some future visits, or at least have our local colleagues go, follow up themselves. So yeah, we're trying to work on that currently.
All right. Thank you very much, Patrick. I've got a question for Philip. And the question is, using the framework that you have, we note that, some of the risks that and the projects, because of climate change, is causing some of the islands to build to build response barriers for flooding. Some of these response barriers are in the form of sea walls and river walls that go up way up the rivers, and as well as building dams to combat flooding. How do you think that we should resolve this? This need for allowing the ecosystem to evolve, as well as protection against flooding and the risk of climate change?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, Tony. A challenging one, I would say. However, it starts by knowing what you have in your catchment. And I believe some catchments are more important than others in that respect. So the first step, we saw Nick's approach, trying to map out, using his system, where things are degraded, where things are still in good state. And I would say that we do need to map. I think Stuart has mentioned yesterday in his overall assessment that, there was still a big need for mapping wetlands, including rivers. We can do that looking at the state of the catchment, the natural cover, for instance. That gives you an indication of how good the catchment might be. I've seen this right throughout the Pacific. The best catchments where you find the most diversity are always the ones that are actually either protected, and I've seen this in Vanuatu, for instance, but also catchment that retain enough, forest cover, and also have little grazing. I think you raise a good question with coastal also. Is keep in mind that coastal areas are often where things are degraded. You see lots of villages and the pigs, going to the rivers and things like that. And the trick will be first, to prevent those animals, and maybe use the new constructions that are needed to do that. In terms of fish passage, yes, new dams would be a problem, but again, they can be put in catchments where they are perhaps less values and where those populations could sustain themselves by moving across catchments. So if you have reservoirs, basically, you can achieve things. But what Patrick has talked about is extremely important too. It makes me think a lot about the locally managed marine areas. I think the secret is not locking up the lands, or even tapu is okay. It's part of the culture in the Pacific. But, working with the local populations, explaining them, what is going to work for them or not is extremely important, I think. And, encouraging that same process we've done for the coastal areas for rivers would be extremely useful. And then once the villages understand that, I think they will hopefully be able, to understand, well, rather than building walls, perhaps we need to shift our village a little bit. It's always hard to shift people, but it's easier, I would argue, in some parts of the Pacific than it is in big cities and places like this. Coastal is also important because I mentioned the zonation. The estuarine zone may disappear because, with sea level rise, you have that very narrow band of estuarine species. And if the sea level rise, you're going to reach the steep slopes straight away. You won't have that flat area, which forms the estuaries. And you may lose the whole raft of species in that zone. So there's all sorts of issues linked to climate change that I'm afraid I don't have yet the answers. But I think that the issue, again, is using dialogue and collaborations with local people.
Philippa, thank you for that. I think we've got time for maybe a few more questions until we are told to leave. But I've got a question that's very interesting, and it's I think it's for you, Patrick, but I'll read it out, and then we'll see. Probably start with Patrick first. So the question is, one problem with water quality monitoring is not calling a closure, but rather identifying when it is safe again. For example, how many clear tests needs to come back to open a shellfish fishery, or allow people to swim there again, and so on. The same idea can be extended to taboo areas or other closures. The action, or to say close down, may create. But the question is, are communities and governments more open to creating a restriction if there is also a plan for reopening?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. The way these taboos have been presented so far is kind of as a permanent ban. But, yeah, I think there are some very important behavioral things to account for. If you say that this is just going to go in for 2 years, then are people just going to wait for that 2-year line and then rush back in? It certainly would be ideal if there are long-term actions on enforcement with destructive fishing practices. So, on the one hand, it would be good to keep people monitoring that permanently. But on the other hand, if the ecosystem does get back to a place of good health and we're able to get, great fishing practices in, then what is the call to remove those parts of the taboo? I think that's a really interesting question and something that should definitely be pursued in the longer term research programs associated with these. So yeah, I can't speak to the wider implications of the water quality determinations for when a water body is determined, something else that might be more in a mixed space. But yeah, I think it's a really good point that trying to account for the long-term implications of a lot of these things when the planning is done, I think is really critical.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments from the panel?
Just a quick one from me. So we're looking at setting up sort of similar reserves in Cambodia, and they've been set up also sort of fairly independently in Thailand. And the experience is that it takes about 5 years for the benefits of the protected area in terms of increased fish catch and larger fish to then flow out to the rest of the river. So we're sort of looking at how do we support the communities, in their, that 5-year period. And then afterwards, they should be, deriving the benefits of, increased fish catch that there'll be widespread support for keeping those protected areas. So yeah, it's more of a long-term sort of proposition rather than closed seasons.
Okay, thank you. So I've got a question here, which is on the impact on freshwater quality from invasive species. So the question is that the impact of invasive species on water quality and the cost that it has on the freshwater index estimates. Do we have any data on that? Because that would be very useful in raising awareness and engaging communities on the impacts of invasive species. So do we have any data on the impacts of invasive species on freshwater quality?
If I may reply, no is the answer. I think they are just observations. Where you go to sites where tilapia, for instance, or gambusia is present, you notice straight away the drop in diversity and potentially the size of native fish populations as well. But this hasn't been quantified yet. It's just qualitative. And that's a good point. I think it could be. And we could go back to those sites and do a bit more work, because the jury is still out for tilapia, for instance. I know the jury, is split between those supporting tilapia. I think tilapia has its place in the Pacific, but it needs to be again in places where catchments are already degraded, where you're not going to cause extra harm. So no is the answer, the short answer. But we could do it.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I think I've been told we can go over a few minutes. We're already 4 minutes over. So maybe just one more question. So the question is, maybe we'll go with your question, Pearl, to Patrick. So the question, Patrick, is for the concentration and participation, did you create special methods? Is there a guideline for concentration with the local population? What were your main difficulties?
Yeah, so for this project in particular, we leveraged some previous efforts. Both Izoa and Lakima from the University of South Pacific had done work in this area before, and so Lakima did his master's research on water quality issues in the local area, and he had some survey questions that were designed for that. We had also done some previous work on mangroves in those areas, and so we tried to pull some of the questions from that survey into our survey. Yeah, and then, you know, as I tried to say in the slides, one of the things we really wanted to make sure we were doing was focus on the spatial and mapping aspects of this. We found that that was really helpful in guiding the discussion and kind of getting people talking and getting people onto the table. Because, yeah, that was certainly one of our concerns, was that, you know, how open would people be to discussing these efforts and some of the benefits and costs of this, because, you know, some of these costs to some people that, you know, fish in the area, they might have significant barriers and be quite against this. So yeah, we wanted to be careful of those types of things. But yeah, so I guess the short answer is just, yeah, leveraging previous efforts done by Zoa and Lakima, the main things.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yep.
I can add something. Tony, I think some of actually Patrick's colleagues, you know, are doing quite a bit of work on how to work with local Maori people. And out of the list of documents or methods I've showed in one of the slides, you may find some information, Pearl, on this as well. So, you know, yeah, I think we are getting good information on how to properly engage with local people. But of course, each culture is different. So from country to country, that may vary. But, you know, I feel there's a common thread there that can be used.
All right, thank you very much. Yes, I know that we're having fun, and there's a lot more questions and a lot more discussions that we can do. But I'd like to bring the session to a close. First, I'd like to thank you all, the speakers. Thank you, Pearl, Nick, Philip, and Patrick. Thank you for sharing with us your experience and your knowledge and your passion for conservation in the Pacific. Yeah? I think that what you've shared for me has been really rewarding, and I hope that it's been the same for our participants as well. I'd like to just remind everyone and remind the participants especially that there is the lounge that you can go to meet the speakers as well as the other participants and the other speakers. So please go to the lounge where you can sit virtually and have a discussion with the speakers from this session as well as the other participants. So thank you, everybody. Whawhetai, merci beaucoup, kia tate. And we'll see you again. Thank you.